Hello. It is so nice to see so many familiar faces. I want to thank Celia and Kunstnernes Hus for inviting me and for this conversation with Emily. I felt very triggered by this film, of course, especially by watching it these days while we are 3 weeks into a war in Europe. And there is so much, of course, questions that arise where reading NATO, for example, and something that I want to briefly just touch upon, but I want just to acknowledge that I couldn't see this film, of course, without connecting it to what's going on these days, where cultural workers and people like us have been forced to rethink their position, and therefore questions of sovereignty and of violence and the right to violence have been completely shifted into the everyday life of people. And in terms to rethink their relation to the state and nations. And I wanted just to say that because it immediately also made me think about questions of prevent, for example, and issues of radicalization, for instance, in the UK, which came about in 2015 or around in the 2010s, where in the UK, for instance, it was not possible to read books, for example, which were blacklisted because they were considered to be radicalizing for or pushing people through to radicalization. And I was thinking about that when I was listening to Isabel de Como, and when she says when they took her notes away, for example, of course, like they took her thoughts away. So I wanted just to, maybe it's an acknowledgement and a thank you both to Kunstnernes Hus and to Emily for making us think into this particular moment about issues of that are very related to the structures we live within, and how also like the structures that we have inherited. But I wanted to go back to the film, or start from the film first and foremost, and because I have so many questions, and I'm sure also you have a lot of questions, and so also like prepare the questions because there will be time for also like questions from you. But I wanted to start from the structure of the film and about the timing and where do you set the timing of this film, because I'm always kind of now that I see it, I'm still quite unsure if this film is positioned in the past, in the present, or in the future, in the sense of tomorrow, where these discussions take place. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that, about the idea of the film and the temporality of the film.
Yeah. Okay. I also wanted to thank Celia for the invitation and to say what a pleasure it is to be in Oslo and to be showing within this structure too of a cinema that's been carved out in order to show moving image that's not industrial cinema. I think this is super important and will always be extremely important to protect these spaces. In terms of the timing of where the film takes place, I think it's a really beautiful question in a way, because one thing that I was trying to avoid was this idea of Isabel de Como is a public figure in Portugal. She's not like an unknown figure that I've somehow discovered upon. She writes for the newspapers there. She's been interviewed countless times about her role in the Revolutionary Brigades. She's also a doctor, and she was always a doctor. She was a practicing doctor throughout her time fighting, as she was part of the Revolutionary Brigades as well. And she specializes now in eating disorders. She's a specialist on anorexia. She became for me, it became important for me to talk to her and to sort of weave her into this story in a way where it also where I also wasn't doing this thing as though politics was something that had happened in the past, and I was interested in making her the mother of two young men who somehow, for me, also kind of encapsulated a type of politics that's very of our time, which is this kind of politics that thinks it's not politics, this sort of ideology that thinks it's not an ideology, which is what we hear them express all the time, and is what we hear a lot from this kind of this sort of techno-utopian genre, if we can call it, this kind of like this demographic. And so to somehow have her as a representative of a utopia, which was like a kind of utopia that was based on the idea of kind of equality, or setting up fighting a dictatorship, specifically fighting a fascist dictatorship, fighting imperialism worldwide, which is also partly why you bring up this idea of the bomb against NATO. NATO also is a kind of having imperialist ambitions. We must remember that the Russian imperialist ambitions are not the only imperialist ambitions that are at play in what's happening currently, and that there's some sort of contrast between like the timelessness, or the sort of the no man's land of his utopia, of this techno-utopia, and the very specific temporal qualities of Isabel's utopia, which she may, at some point she kind of says it was a failed utopia. She says that we were naive. She said that it was, we didn't understand, we were thinking of ourselves in Portugal, we weren't thinking of ourselves kind of internationally, but actually also contextually we know that it wasn't just their own naivety that thwarted that attempt at a kind of the establishment of a communist state. There was many forces that acted against that externally too.
Yeah, because the other thing, which is kind of like the structural decision of the film, is that you make this revolutionary woman that comes from armed struggle, from a very specific history in Portugal. She gives birth to this, or she's the mother of two astrophysicists. Metaphorically, of course, there is quite a statement. I cannot but read that there is a statement in there, as if, like the technology that we have inherited today are the directly ancestors of, like those revolutions, that they were imagining a different future. But, so I'm very curious how you build this kind of idea also to rebring these revolutions, which, like we have seen played with more known, the Red Brigades in Italy, the RAF in Germany, but it's a complete also different history in Portugal. How this family is born and why.
I don't really see them as the natural product of her. That's not what I was getting at really with this birthing, they being birthed by her. It was more that in families you often have a context where you will have very opposing political views within two generations, and an inability to escape. And I was interested in how, since social media has kind of polarized the information that we get that's fed to us based on the information that we look at, and that what that does to us in terms of our own kind of issue silos and being entrenched in our own issue silos. I was looking at the family as a place where that is less present, that you can have within generations and families completely different political views. I don't see at all techno-utopianism as the inevitable child of communist revolutionaries, not at all. And I don't see that there was anything natural also even in the destruction of communism, or that it was defeated because it was unworkable or irrational. I think that was like a long, hard battle that was fought, a kind of an ideological battle and a military battle.
But this idea of motherhood, because there is, I think, something very particular that it also belongs to the history of the the armed struggle in Portugal, which I haven't read about before, with the Red Brigades or other armed movements of the women, which were structurally behind building the infrastructure for these attacks. Maybe you can tell, because that story is very, very strong. It also builds on the idea of documentary and fiction, as also we hear in the film, because they build life stories and life narratives that are not necessarily reality or what we understand as reality. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
So I did quite a lot of research that built up to these interviews that I did with Isabel de Carmo, partly because my Portuguese is not great. I had to write all of that down, and one of the books that I read was a book called Mulheres de Clandestinidade, like women living in secret, or underground women, by Vanessa de Almeida. And I asked Isabel about this particular theatre. It's like a kind of theatre that went alongside the Communist Party in Portugal were really organised and had been really organised for a really long time, and that's partly what fed into the success of the eventual overthrow of Salazar, or the dictatorship. Salazar had already died at that point. And part of that organisation was this structure of secret housing that was supported by these women who were never really taken into account in this much heralded and much kind of celebrated fight against the dictatorship. And Isabel, what she's talking about there, and what I think she really wanted to foreground, was how long that commitment was when women went underground and pretended to be the housewives of these fake families. That, you know, like in France that might be for 5 years, but in Portugal that was for 20 years. So you would be giving up 20 years of your life, and then it was a political decision. You know, you'd be leaving your family, you'd be leaving your real life in order to kind of maintain this fiction for a really long time, and that maintenance of that fiction was key to the success of that resistance. And that was interesting to me for a number of reasons, partly because obviously that chimed with a lot of the stuff that I was reading with in Federici, this idea of like women's labour not being remunerated, it becoming invisible, stuff that we still see today, this idea of like motherhood being this thing that's not, that if you decide that you're going to stay home and look after kids, that people say you're doing nothing, or like this like these things that are really kind of pernicious and still with us, that were already being fought for then, and this seemed like a kind of echo of that too. So these fake housewives were being ignored in the same way that housework was being unremunerated. But then on top of that, what it also seemed to be is some kind of like a predecessor to what someone like an artist like Cindy Sherman was talking about with that Rosalind Krauss wrote about famously, this kind of performance of femininity, and that this would somehow, that you could somehow read this as having crossed the Atlantic and being sort of played out in this way, but where the stakes were extremely high. And that for me was really interesting. There's this bit in that no one ever sees because I think it's too fast, but there's this bit where you're going through these ruinous architecture, and there's I've done these recreations of Sherman's untitled film stills, and then they just come through like a flashing light, and it was like me also trying to think about that crossing of the Atlantic, which, just to become more Byzantine, was also because I was thinking about Lisbon as being the whole kind of promotion of Lisbon as a techno hub is modelled on San Francisco and what was happened, the success that happened in San Francisco, which is, as you know, this sort of techno, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, like a techno horror or some sort of techno utopia, and that they want this, that some sort of way of getting past the tragedy that was befell Portugal and Troika would be to promote it as this new San Francisco.
Maybe because you speak about technology, I think it's also like maybe we can go a little bit into the image, both the image production in the film, but also like the way in which the astrophysicists speak about images, because I find it fascinating this idea that machines can produce a reality which is more rich of the reality there is out there. And like I have my ideas around it, but I'm very curious about also your perspective on because it's again about technology in terms of like militarized technology as well, which is part of astrophysics as well, and mapping also of lands and imperialism. Maybe there is also a connection with the armed brigades. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think my favourite bit in the film is a kind of mashup that I did between Isabel talking about dialectical materialism and Alexander and Jalal talking about, or Jalal specifically talking about how the machine learning algorithm that they're trying to develop is a machine learning algorithm to get machines to recognize moving images, and how you actually make that happen. And what happens in that, what seems to happen between that when you put those two voices together, is that she's talking about dialectical materialism as the most important part for her of Marxism, which is that you constantly adapt the philosophy that you're working by, or the ideology that you're working by, to what is changing and moving in front of you. Whereas what he describes the machine doing is that you're constantly feeding in moving images into a machine which is essentially blind, and sometimes it will work and you don't know if it's worked or it hasn't worked. It's like the opposite. One is this learning, and this is also interesting in the language, like machine learning is not an innocent phrase. You don't have to you could just call it machine controlling, which would be closer to or machine categorizing, but they don't. They kind of co-opt the language of education, and as someone who's taught for a long time, that's deeply insulting to me. So this machine learning, which isn't machine learning, it's machine cataloging. What it is doing is actually kind of blindly taking in a lot of stuff, and then sometimes it will get it right and you don't know why, you don't know, and you also don't know how. It's just sort of like this completely blind process. But also what he says, and it blows my mind at some point, he says that you can create many more images artificially than you can ever find in the real world. And you get this sense that he really believes that this is true. And he's not that young. He's like 35, and he's also not he's a friend, like he's not a person, he's not a completely robotic character, but you sort of feel that this is something that's happened, that the idea that organic matter, or the world, or even the fact that we might need food in order to survive, has been completely superseded by this simulacra upon simulacra upon simulacra, that is then becoming more, not just useful or not just more important, but just making us blind to that which is in front of us. And this seemed to me like, I think in a way I find it kind of frightening to hear them talk to each other in this way, because it says so much about the climate crisis, for instance, or
But maybe that idea of knowledge as well, because it comes back also in the words of Isabel about the fact that, for instance, she says that in Italy there was Gramsci, there was Togliatti, there was a lot of historicization enabling revolution to come, while in Portugal that never happened somehow in the way in which, like with such a substantiated background. So I'm very curious about this idea of knowledge as well, and how knowledge informs all of, even and especially, armed struggle, the idea of machine cataloging, and like how of counter movements, and how to create counter movements in that sense.
Yeah, it's a very famous. What she's saying is a more detailed version of a very famous history that's generally accepted in Portugal, that Portugal didn't experience modernity because Salazar purposefully kept the entire population poor and illiterate, and then was propelled into post-modernity, having not experienced modernity. and I think that's something that you can really feel actually, like when you're in Portugal. There's some sort of strange some things. So in some ways, it means that things have been protected, like certain parts of the natural world have been protected, for instance. But in other ways, it means that you haven't had, you haven't had like a kind of socialization of wealth hasn't taken place. And I think when she's talking about Gramsci and she's saying that that Portugal lacked intellectuals in order to sort of consolidate what was being fought for, what she was fighting for, what they were fighting for, it's also somehow reflects that that lack of, she calls it mechanical. She said that Marxism there was mechanical and that they were trying to fight it from using their links with other revolutionary organizations worldwide. You know, when Isabel was imprisoned with her daughter in 78 after the revolution, which is also telling, and she, it was Angela Davis's lawyers that got her out of prison. So they had these kind of vast networks also of kind of this kind of very cosmopolitan network of revolutionaries that wasn't, so you kind of get the feeling that was necessary because of this sort of lack of an intellectual elite there, but that she sort of made up for it through international ties.
You just reminded me that there is a book that you made, which it's very cinematographic in my eyes, which maybe you can just like share with everybody how this book is made, because there are some references, for instance, also to Angela Davis and the Black Panthers and these networks as well that were vital during those years, also in order to move against this oppressive machine and state machines and imperial machines. And so I think that maybe you can say something about the book. And
yeah, sure. So there's I have a website, it's emilywardill.com, and on my website, in my publications bit, you can get a free PDF of this book that I made that was like an artist book for Secession. So when this film was made, initially I showed it in Secession in Vienna. And the book, they don't do catalogues in Secession. They do this thing where you can do an artist book that runs alongside the exhibition. And the book contains, it's sort of like a sketchbook of all of the research that I did that fed into the interviews, and then bits and bobs of other extra interviews that didn't make it in, and also interviews with Isabel in kind of, I spent some time in the library finding other source material. So it's quite good to sort of expand upon upon bits of the film.
And before I move back to some more philosophical questions, maybe it's also so this film is circulating in different forms. You present it as a film, but because of the work that you did with Secession, it was born as an installation, and maybe it's also interesting to understand how it is circulating.
I sort of wanted it to circulate as much as possible now, because I think it's quite of its time, and I'm also aware now that I'm older that things have their lifespan, and you kind of have to do it when they're fresh. So I'm sort of trying to get it around, and also what am I talking about? I'm just rambling. That's just it, really.
I wanted really to ask you this question about there is a moment when Isabel speaks about life, and I mean, there is this very interesting paradox of someone who is a founder of a movement which is, and you know, they have weapons in their hands and they are working on actions which are based on weaponry, and then she says, no, but you know, like life, it stands as the most important philosophical question. She's a doctor. You know, it's a very interesting paradox, which maybe you have more background also into these assertions. Or
she's obviously she's not the only one from the Revolutionary Brigades. There were others, but she, I feel, aged very well because of her relationship to the body and her relationship to. She was always a practicing doctor, and it's sometimes other people, I think, maybe because they lived clandestinely for so long, got used to lying and can't tell the difference between truth and lies anymore, or they sort of became a bit slippery. Isabel never really became slippery. She always, I feel like she was always centered back on the body, and I wanted also to give her a chance to speak philosophically, because I feel that she has a very specific praxis for her ideology that's not just based in the fact that she went out and put her communist ideals into action, into kind of like violent action, but that she also put them into medical action, and that's ongoing. And when she talks about this thing about the body being something that you can never repeat, it really I wanted also to bring it in at the end so that it came to contrast with this voice of Alan Rickman, who's the last voice that comes in to talk this poem, this sort of poem that I wrote about why it's called Night for Day. And that voice, the conceit of that is that I got this Adobe software where I can kind of record one of you saying something for 2 seconds and then I can get you to say anything. That's not what I did, but that's the conceit of it, because that software is not on the market. But that's like the idea of it. And that Alan Rickman, who passed, but who had previously played the dead lover of a woman, and who comes back to haunt her. That's the era of his voice that I tried to recreate. So like a young Alan Rickman, not like Alan Rickman when he's Snape. Like when he's still playing romantic leads. And he then, what I was trying to do this thing also of like, sure, we've been recording voice for a long time. We've had that idea of like someone's died and we can still listen to their voice for a long time, so they can come back and haunt us through a technology. But that idea that you can actually get someone to say your words after they've died is really creepy to us and uncanny to us still. And that's also why the software's so contentious, because I don't believe it's just the fake news thing, although of course that's a main part of it. But it's also something of like, we're not quite ready for that to be on the market. And so to have that present next to her saying that the life is this thing that you can't ever repeat was somehow important to me. And Rickman seemed like a good that very specific voice, but also that he played this part, and that also his career had become calcified because he played Harry Potter and it brought him a lot of money, but it was also, you know, he was much more than that. And you know, these things that happen to people as artists creatively too, through industrial cinema.
I think that we're soon opening for questions, but if you have already questions, maybe you can raise your hands. There is a question of sound as well, maybe because you reminded me with her comment on continuum, and the continuum of the body as well, about this very precise sound, which I'm very curious what that stands for, how it was created, and if it's there to set the rhythm of the film, or how you came to that.
So the sound that you hear a lot is the triangle, this very simple musical instrument, and I was thinking a lot about the triangle being played in the round. So the music is composed to be like Frere Jacques, you play it in the round. And then that for me became important because the house was also, when you zoom back from Google Maps, the house is also built to look like a triangle from outer space. And that there was this thing also that the images come in threes. And then Jalal talks about Bayesian frequency being this thing that you can, that was very important in astrophysics because you could suddenly make large conclusions based on a sample size of 3. And so this thing of like triangles and rounds suddenly became very important to me.
And just my last sort of question, which is also structural. You said something before about the fact that, I mean, I have a question which is more about the duration of the film, the length. I just came to realize also, because you spoke before about a feature film, and a film that is almost self-made, or as if it is like a cyborg who is making the film. Can you tell us a little bit more about this idea of the machine, which is in itself in the film?
Yeah, I was trying to get the idea that maybe at some point you would think that the sun was a computer and that the computer had made the film, and that the computer had made the film through trawling through surveillance footage or footage on the internet, or like I was thinking also about this Michel Order piece, Journey Through the Phone Lines, where he taps other people's phone conversations and makes that into the piece. That like the dialogue could also be from tapped phone conversations, because at some point they start having an argument about it, the two sons, that like would it be possible for a machine to make a film. And when I started thinking about that too, it's really exciting, like what that might look like, you know, if it was trying to look like a conventional narrative film.
Do you have any question before I ask more questions?
Here's a mic, if you don't mind. I think it's nice that everyone hears the question.
Yeah, a couple of things. By the way, thanks for the film. Just on that last note of like a machine kind of making a film. I don't know if you've seen the von Trier movie, the director of the whole thing. I don't know what it's called in English, Direktøren for det hele. But that one has the premise of like there's a very, in one way, very rudimentary like comedic narrative, like in an office space, kind of playing on like cringe comedy. But where every kind of, I mean, there are several cameras for each scene, but like the selection is kind of arbitrary, or it's like machine decided. So I just thought of that first. And secondly, this thing like triangles and orbs, I was just wondering about the context for that. What seemed like a performance piece or installation that's kind of happening with this like pendulous orb and these performers.
Yeah, so in Secession, there were these two chairs that were hanging on the same piece of rope, and they were hung by the Shibuki practitioner. That's what he's doing. He's hanging those chairs, which is actually really hard to hang two chairs from the same piece of rope. And then I was trying to have this, or like it's a sphere that it kind of shows you the conservation of energy, because down there in Secession, I wasn't in the main space of Secession, I was in the basement. And so I was really trying to work with a basement in Austria and think about like what that means. But also there's only one bit where like light enters there, and it's all about day for night. And I was thinking a lot about like cyclical time and digital time, and how you might mark time. So this thing was also supposed to act like this kind of hypnotic conservation of energy thing, and then it enters into the film like through that. Really, is like a mirror of the installation.
I find it almost a bit cosmic.
I'm glad you find it almost a bit cosmic. Yeah, it sometimes looks like the eclipse. Yeah. No, that was nice also. Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, maybe that thing of going in the round is also very hypnotic. I was thinking about it in a much more, I don't know what the word would be like. It was almost like it was just there for me. Because actually in the way that this film came together, which was very slowly and very alongside my life, it happened quite diaristically. So when I watch it, it's always quite emotional. Because it reminds me of like those years of my life. But it's not, I don't know. Huh? Good. Yeah, it's just like funny. It's just like
there is also like this interesting part, which is like about this reference that say you should never work with animals or children. Is that must that you learn in film school, or I mean, it's also like I find that there is also like a subversive sort of space that leads to, you know, like the fact that also machines you should, and there is a reference also to a female machine as well in that sense.
It's W.C. Fields. It's a famous comedian who said you should never work with children or animals, and it makes me think. One of my favorite filmmakers is Kira Muratova. I don't know if you know her work, but she works a lot with children and animals, and she works also a lot with the weather. And it seems to me like she's trying to work with stuff which is uncontrollable, and that aphorism, "never work with children or animals," is also like about. It just speaks volumes of men trying to control women to me, or like only controlling things that you can, only working with things that you can control or dominate, and that these female models dressed up as machines are like perfect because of that. And then how often that keeps on repeating throughout film history. You know, like I go back to the Tales of Hoffmann, but you know, you can go back to Metropolis. You can go back as far as you want, and they're there. And why does this thing keep on repeating? It's like it's not so hard to work out why that keeps on repeating. Right up to Westworld.
Do you have more? Oh, yes. Here.
I'm just wondering about the ballet scenes and what the inspiration about that was, and like kind of some classical music as well involved in the opera. So, wondering how that all fit together.
Thank you for asking. No one ever asks about the Tales of Hoffmann. So the Tales of Hoffmann was a Powell and Pressburger film that was. There's this very famous story that Martin Scorsese used to take it out of the New York Public Library, and sometimes it wouldn't be there because Jorge Romero had it, and when things were on VHS tape, and it was in there because it's a really extraordinary film, and I had been watching it years ago on my computer. My laptop had started to like a DVD on a laptop, and the DVD has started to degenerate, and I filmed it, and I knew at some point this is going to be useful. And then when I was making this film, for which like it was really hard to get funding, so I was really scrabbling things out of all over the place to try and get it to come together to be a real film. And then it sort of fit in, but also because I was working in Secession, and when you work in Secession, they don't want you to do anything. Please don't do anything about Freud or Beethoven, because everybody does something about Freud or Beethoven, but like you want to because you're in Secession. And this was my way also of thinking about that, because Freud was obsessed with Hoffmann, and this is like it's a really early version of a fembot, but it's also beautifully one of the hardest arias to sing in the entire operatic repertoire, because it's a woman that's pretending to be a machine that was pretending to be a woman. So this love song that you have at the end is this, she's having to go all over the place, like all over the register, but she's also having to do it in this completely inhuman way, which somehow also was this way of getting the music to be like a document of what we're talking about without it having to be so direct.
Other questions? I know that some of you are very lucky because you are going to have Emily for sessions tomorrow. So may I ask more questions? But I think also that we're still for a few minutes around, so maybe you want to ask questions informally so that you will if you feel more comfortable. Otherwise, I will just invite everybody to thank Emily with a round of applause. Thank you.